Fred Rogers built a reputation that almost nobody thought could ever be questioned. For decades, he stood as the symbol of patience, compassion, and understanding on American television. Parents trusted him. Children adored him. Even long after his death, his influence never truly disappeared. But behind the scenes, some moments from his life told a far more uncomfortable story than the one audiences saw on screen. Quiet decisions made away from the cameras would later spark controversy, divide opinions, and leave people wondering how much they really knew about the man behind Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the lonely boy behind Mr. Rogers. Whether he was comforting children through a television screen or simply offering kindness to strangers, Fred Rogers understood something that many people spend a lifetime trying to learn. Helping others mattered. That belief didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was planted in him early, largely because of the example set by his mother. She was known for her compassion long before Fred ever became famous. As a young woman, she had dreamed of becoming a doctor. When that path didn't work out, she refused to let go of her desire to care for people. Instead, she devoted herself to volunteer work at the local hospital, and during World War II, she spent countless hours knitting sweaters for soldiers overseas. Helping people was simply part of who she was, and young Fred absorbed every bit of it. But while kindness filled his home, the outside world felt very different. On paper, the Rogers family lived comfortably. Fred's father was one of the most successful businessmen in their community, and financially, the family had stability. Yet none of that protected Fred from the loneliness that followed him through childhood. He struggled with his weight from an early age, and other kids noticed. According to the Fred Rogers Center, classmates regularly mocked him, turning him into an easy target for bullying. Years later, during a speech at St. Vincent College in 1995, Rogers admitted just how painful those years really were. He remembered feeling completely alone, often crying by himself because he believed he had no real friends. One memory stayed with him more than any other: neighborhood kids chasing him down the street while shouting the nickname Fat Freddy. And the bullying was only part of the battle. Fred also dealt with severe asthma, along with what felt like every childhood illness imaginable. The polluted industrial air of western Pennsylvania made things even worse, forcing him to spend many summer days trapped indoors while other children played outside. Between asthma attacks, hay fever, scarlet fever, and constant sickness, he became deeply familiar with isolation at a very young age. For a naturally shy child, that kind of solitude could have been crushing. But in Fred's case, something remarkable happened. The loneliness pushed him inward into a world powered entirely by imagination. While stuck in bed recovering from illnesses, he began creating entire worlds in his mind. Blankets became landscapes, bedrooms became stages, ordinary objects transformed into characters and stories. Years later, Rogers would reflect on those moments by explaining that his bedspread had essentially become his own neighborhood of make-believe. Without realizing it, he was already building the foundation for the world that millions of children would someday step into alongside him. Thankfully, he wasn't completely alone through all of it. Fred shared a close bond with his grandfather, whose presence helped soften some of the loneliness weighing on him. Around that same time, he also developed a fascination with puppets. What started as a simple childhood interest quickly became something much deeper. Puppetry gave him a way to express emotions that were difficult to say out loud. Through characters, he could speak freely, connect with others, and create comfort in a world that often felt cold and unwelcoming. Little by little, things began changing. By the time Fred reached high school, the shy, isolated boy from earlier years was beginning to grow into someone more confident. Making friends no longer felt impossible. He threw himself into school activities, eventually becoming editor-in-chief of the yearbook and president of the student council. The same child who once struggled to connect with anyone was now stepping into leadership roles. But underneath all of that growth was still the same deeply compassionate person who wanted to make a difference. After graduating high school, Rogers decided he wanted to serve his country however he could. In 1948, he registered for the draft and initially received a 1A classification, meaning he was considered fit for service. But 2 years later, a routine physical changed everything. The military officially declared him unqualified due to his health. In another life, that moment could have devastated him. Instead, it quietly redirected him toward the path he had truly been meant to follow all along. Coming from a financially successful family, Fred Rogers had opportunities most people could only dream about. He could have pursued wealth, business, or almost any profession he wanted. But none of that interested him nearly as much as music and human connection. He enrolled at Dartmouth College before eventually transferring to Rollins College, where he pursued a degree in music. And he didn't just do well there, he excelled, graduating magna cum laude in 1951 with a Bachelor of Music degree. College also brought another life-changing moment into his world. During his time at Rollins, Fred met a fellow music student named Sarah Joanne Bird, who was studying piano. Their connection formed quickly and deeply. Long before the world knew him as Mr. Rogers, Fred had already found the person who would remain at the center of his life. Joanne became his partner, his support system, and eventually the mother of their 2 sons. As Fred's fame later grew across America, so did public fascination with his personal life. But unlike so many celebrities whose private lives became tabloid headlines, Rogers remained completely devoted to his family. Friends who knew the couple personally often spoke about his unwavering loyalty and how seriously he took his marriage vows. Still, as happy as his personal life had become, Fred soon found himself facing an enormous decision about his future. Part of him felt called toward ministry. His faith mattered deeply to him, and seminary school seemed like a natural next step. But during the early 1950s, another force was rapidly reshaping America: television. Fred immediately recognized its power. Television sets were appearing in homes across the country at an astonishing pace, and Rogers saw something that many others missed. He realized the screen could become more than entertainment. It could become a tool for compassion, education, and emotional connection. If he truly wanted to help people on the largest scale possible, television offered a direct path into millions of homes. That realization changed everything. Almost immediately after graduating college, Rogers landed a job with NBC as a floor director. It wasn't some tiny entry-level role either. He worked behind the scenes on major programs like The Kate Smith Hour and a children's show hosted by Gabby Hayes. For a young man just starting out, it was an incredible opportunity to learn how television really worked. But Fred wanted more than technical experience. He wanted creative purpose. That desire eventually brought him to Philadelphia, where he joined the public television station WQED. There, he partnered with Josie Carey to help create a children's program called The Children's Corner. And before long, one particular part of the show revealed exactly where Fred Rogers truly belonged: the puppets. The moment those characters came to life, something clicked. The shy child who once hid from the world behind imagination and storytelling had finally found the perfect way to connect with it. The turning point in Fred's career. While The Children's Corner was officially a collaboration between Fred Rogers and Josie Carey, the two played very different roles. Josie became the familiar face viewers saw on screen each day, while Fred worked tirelessly behind the curtain, shaping the soul of the program piece by piece. And he was doing far more than most people realized. Fred wrote music for the show, developed story ideas, and built the personalities that made the program feel warm and alive. But perhaps most importantly, he returned to one of the passions that had carried him through childhood loneliness years earlier: puppetry. He didn't just operate the puppets, he personally created every single one of them by hand. For Fred, inventing characters never felt like work. It was one of the things he loved most. Some personalities came purely from his imagination, while others borrowed small pieces from real people in his life. Daniel the Striped Tiger, for example, was named after the station manager at WQED. Queen Sarah Saturday drew her name from Fred's wife, Sarah. In a quiet way, the people closest to him slowly became woven into the world he was creating for children. At the same time, another important part of his life was still unfolding in the background. Even though he had successfully entered the television industry, Fred had not abandoned his calling toward ministry. Instead of choosing one path over the other, he decided to pursue both at once. While continuing his television work, he enrolled at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and dedicated himself to his religious studies. Before long, he officially became an ordained Presbyterian minister. Suddenly, Fred Rogers stood at a crossroads very few people could even imagine. On one side was traditional ministry. On the other was television, a medium that was rapidly growing inside American homes. By the mid-1960s, he had become both a respected television creator and an ordained minister. But deep down, Fred already knew which direction he believed mattered most. He came to see television as his ministry. While many pastors reached people from behind a pulpit, Fred believed he could reach far more hearts through a television screen. His approach, however, was incredibly different from what most people expected from a minister. He never hid the fact that his values were deeply shaped by Christianity, but he also never felt the need to preach directly to audiences. Instead, he lived his message: kindness, patience, compassion, honesty, emotional understanding. Those became his sermons. Rather than telling people how to behave, he tried to show them through his actions. And in the process, he discovered exactly who he wanted to help most: children. The more Fred worked in the children's television, the more he noticed something troubling. Most programs aimed at kids were focused almost entirely on entertainment, but very few truly cared about children's emotional needs. Hardly anyone was speaking to them thoughtfully or treating their feelings with genuine respect. That realization changed the course of his career. Determined to create something more meaningful, Fred began working closely with child psychologist Margaret McFarland, who became one of the most important creative influences in his life. Together, they carefully studied how children thought, learned, feared, and processed emotions. Fred soaked up every lesson he could, shaping his future programs around helping children feel safe, understood, and valued. Then, just as his vision was becoming clearer, an unexpected opportunity arrived. By the early 1960s, Fred Rogers had earned a strong reputation within public television circles, even though most viewers still had no idea who he was. People in the industry recognized his creativity and talent behind the scenes, and eventually, that reputation reached Canada. In 1963, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation approached him with a major offer. They wanted him to move to Toronto and host a brand new children's program called Mr. Rogers. For Fred, the opportunity was both exciting and terrifying. Up to that point, he had always stayed comfortably behind the camera. He knew how to write, produce, create puppets, and build stories. But stepping directly in front of the audience was something entirely different. The CBC believed strongly in his abilities, yet they also wanted him to do the one thing he had never truly done before: become the face of the show. Naturally, he hesitated. The thought of appearing on camera intimidated him, especially given how shy he had been for most of his life. But the head of children's programming at the CBC encouraged him to think about it differently. They explained that being on television was really no different than simply sitting down and speaking gently to children, something Fred already did naturally. That reassurance changed everything. Once he finally stepped in front of the camera, something clicked almost immediately. The soft-spoken creator, who once preferred hiding behind puppets, suddenly became the calm, comforting presence audiences would soon fall in love with. For 4 years, Fred hosted Mr. Rogers throughout its run in Canada, steadily growing more confident and refining the style that would later make him world famous. But eventually, he realized he wanted to build something even bigger, and he had no intention of leaving his work behind. Rather than walking away from the show he had worked so hard to create, Fred purchased the rights himself. Then he packed up his family, returned to the United States, and began preparing for the next chapter of his career. To make it happen, he turned once again to the people he trusted most at WQED in Pittsburgh. Using many of the same puppets, sets, and creative ideas he had already developed over the years, Fred launched a new version of the program called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. At first, the show only aired throughout the northeastern United States, and despite its growing fan base, the future looked shaky almost immediately. Behind the scenes, Fred had every reason to be nervous. Television was a ruthless business, especially for small educational programs trying to survive financially. Even though viewers connected deeply with the show, money quickly became a major problem. By 1967, WQED simply ran out of funding and was forced to cancel the program altogether. For many shows, that would have been the end of the story. But this time, something unexpected happened. The audience refused to let the show disappear quietly. Fans flooded the station with support and made it clear they didn't want Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to vanish. Their reaction was so overwhelming that WQED began desperately searching for outside funding to save the series. Eventually, help arrived through a major agreement with the Sears Roebuck Foundation. With fresh financial backing finally secured, Fred Rogers received the opportunity he had been fighting for all along. And this time, it became clear that his gentle little neighborhood was not going anywhere. The secret behind Fred's influence. With financial backing finally secured through the Sears Roebuck Foundation, Fred Rogers' vision was no longer confined to a small regional audience. In 1968, the show officially relaunched under the name Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and what started as a modest educational program quickly grew into one of the most beloved series in television history. Over time, it would go on to produce an astonishing 895 episodes. But Fred Rogers wasn't the only person who understood how badly children needed thoughtful, meaningful television. Even leaders in Washington had started recognizing the same problem. Before leaving office, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for the creation of the Public Broadcasting Service, believing educational programming deserved serious national support. His proposal included $20 million in funding to help public television thrive across America. The problem was, Johnson would not be the one making the final decision. That responsibility fell to incoming President Richard Nixon, and Nixon had very different priorities. With the Vietnam War consuming enormous amounts of money and attention, public broadcasting simply did not rank high on his list. He wanted to cut the proposed PBS budget in half. Fred Rogers could have stayed quiet. Instead, he stepped directly into one of the most important moments of his entire life. By 1969, Rogers was respected enough within television circles to receive an invitation to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Communications regarding the proposed funding cuts. On May 1st, he walked into that hearing room carrying a written statement explaining why educational television mattered so deeply for children. But once he got there, something changed. Fred quickly realized that reading pages of prepared remarks would never fully capture what he felt. So instead, he spoke from the heart. The lawmakers sitting before him didn't see a timid television host that day. They saw someone passionately defending the emotional well-being of children. Drawing from years of first-hand experience, Rogers explained how children struggled with fear, anger, sadness, and confusion, and how programs like his could help them process those emotions in healthy ways. At one point, he even recited lyrics from one of his songs about handling feelings constructively. The entire testimony lasted only a few minutes, but the impact was immediate. Senator John Pastore, who initially seemed skeptical, became visibly moved as Rogers spoke. By the end of the hearing, Pastore admitted Fred had given him goosebumps and declared that PBS deserved the full funding request. Just like that, the $20 million remained intact. Over the years, that moment became legendary. Many people later pointed to Rogers' testimony as one of the greatest examples of how sincerity and compassion could influence government policy. His biographer, Maxwell King, would eventually describe it as one of the most powerful congressional testimonies ever delivered. Meanwhile, Fred himself remained focused on the thing he cared about most: the children watching at home. What separated Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from almost every other kids program on television was its emotional honesty. While shows like Sesame Street concentrated heavily on teaching numbers, letters, and basic academic skills, Fred Rogers focused on something many adults overlooked entirely: children's feelings. He believed kids deserved help understanding the difficult parts of life, not protection from every uncomfortable subject. As a result, the show tackled issues most children's programs would never dare approach. Over the years, Rogers gently discussed divorce, grief, fear, anger, death, and even national tragedies like the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And through all of it, he never spoke down to children. Fred treated young viewers with remarkable respect. He believed they were capable of understanding hard truths if those truths were explained with patience, honesty, and compassion. What made all of this even more extraordinary was the sheer amount of work he personally handled himself. Even after the show gained national recognition and larger financial support, Rogers continued pouring himself into nearly every aspect of production. Over the course of the series, he wrote roughly 200 songs, created countless characters, edited scripts, supervised episodes, and still performed his regular hosting duties in front of the camera. For most people, that workload would have been overwhelming. For Fred, it was personal. Nothing mattered more to him than the connection he shared with his audience. From the earliest days of the show, he personally responded to every letter children sent him. Even after the mail became too overwhelming to manage alone and assistants stepped in to help organize it, Fred still made sure he personally read and signed every response. Children were never just viewers to him. They were individuals who deserved to feel heard. By the 1970s, the transformation in Fred Rogers was almost unbelievable. The lonely, painfully shy boy who once struggled to speak up had become one of the most recognizable and admired faces in America. Interview requests poured in constantly, and despite still battling nervousness before appearances, he gradually became known for his warmth, quick wit, and remarkable ability to speak naturally from the heart. People trusted him. That trust soon carried him far beyond television studios. As Rogers' influence grew, universities across the country began inviting him to deliver commencement speeches. Even though public speaking still made him anxious, he eventually gave more than 150 commencement addresses throughout his life, offering graduates the same kindness and wisdom that had made him famous on television. At the same time, political leaders continued seeking out his insight as well. In 1970, President Richard Nixon invited Rogers to serve as chairman of the White House Conference on Children and Youth. The same administration that had once considered cutting PBS funding now viewed Fred Rogers as one of the nation's leading voices on childhood development. That alone said everything about the impact he had made. By this point, Fred had also gained enough influence to take full ownership of his creative future. In 1971, he founded Family Communications, Inc., a nonprofit organization that officially assumed production and licensing responsibilities for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Decades later, that same organization would continue producing children's programming under the name Fred Rogers Productions. And then, just when it seemed like his career had reached unstoppable momentum, Fred Rogers shocked everyone. In 1975, he announced that he was stepping away from producing and hosting Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The decision stunned audiences nationwide. Fred still believed deeply in the show's mission, but after years of nonstop work, he wanted to challenge himself creatively and explore programming aimed at adults. Over the next several years, he experimented with projects like Old Friends, New Friends, a 1978 interview series designed to bridge generational divides by bringing conversations between younger and older people to television. Unfortunately, the show struggled badly and lasted only 20 episodes. Still, the experience turned out to be important for Fred personally. His time away from the neighborhood gave him something he desperately needed: rest. For years, he had carried an exhausting workload while constantly giving emotional energy to millions of viewers. Stepping away helped him recharge creatively and emotionally, and eventually he realized exactly where he belonged. In 1979, Fred Rogers returned to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as both producer and host, beginning what many longtime fans consider one of the strongest eras of the series. He had already become famous before leaving, but after his return, his place in television history became undeniable. By the 1980s, Fred Rogers was no longer simply a beloved television personality. He had become a cultural institution. One symbol of that legacy stood out more than almost anything else: his sweaters. The cozy cardigans he wore during nearly every episode became iconic across generations of viewers. Even more touching was the fact that each sweater had been lovingly hand-knit by his mother. In recognition of his enormous cultural impact, the Smithsonian Institution placed one of those sweaters on display in 1984. As the 1990s arrived, admiration for Fred only continued growing stronger. By then, millions of children who had grown up watching Mr. Rogers were adults themselves, and many realized just how deeply his lessons had shaped their lives. In 1997, the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Emmy Award, recognizing the confidence and compassion he had instilled in generations of children. But even someone as dedicated as Fred Rogers could not keep going forever. By the late 1990s, the intense workload that he had carried for decades was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He slowly reduced production to around 15 episodes per year, though stepping back emotionally proved far harder than reducing the schedule itself. Eventually, he understood that the decision could no longer wait. As the new millennium began, Fred Rogers recognized that his time on television was nearing its end. Rather than allowing age or illness to force him away unexpectedly, he chose to make the decision himself. In 2001, at 73 years old, he officially announced his retirement. The final original episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired on August 31st that same year, bringing nearly 3 decades of groundbreaking television to a close. Even then, Fred had no interest in slowing down completely. Though he stepped away from hosting, he remained heavily involved with Family Communications, Inc., continuing to mentor, speak publicly, and encourage others however he could. But quietly, behind the scenes, his health had begun deteriorating. About a year into retirement, ongoing stomach pain finally pushed him to seek medical attention. The diagnosis was devastating: stomach cancer. Even after learning the news, Fred refused to abandon his responsibilities. In many ways, continuing to work became his way of coping. When doctors discussed treatment plans with him, he actually postponed procedures so he could fulfill a commitment to serve as Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade first. That level of dedication perfectly captured who he was. Eventually, after his schedule cleared, Rogers underwent surgery. But despite treatment efforts, his condition worsened rapidly in the months that followed. On February 27, 2003, Fred Rogers passed away at home beside his wife Joanne. He played Mr. Rogers, now Fred McFeely's Dark Secrets Come to Light. For millions of people across America, losing Fred Rogers felt deeply personal. It didn't matter whether they had ever met him face-to-face or only knew him through a television screen. To many, his passing felt like losing a father figure, a calm, reassuring presence who had been there through childhood, fear, uncertainty, and change. The day after his death, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported that by noon, the internet had already been overwhelmed with tributes from people sharing stories about how profoundly Rogers had shaped their lives. Adults who once watched him as children suddenly found themselves grieving someone who had quietly guided them for decades. And in many ways, his influence never really disappeared. Even years later, people still turn to old episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood during difficult moments, searching for the same comfort and reassurance they once found as kids. That gentle sense of safety Fred created somehow managed to outlive him. Still, like many influential public figures, not every part of his story remained untouched by controversy. One of the most discussed and complicated chapters of Fred Rogers' life centered around Francois Clemens, the actor and singer best known for portraying Officer Clemens on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Their relationship began long before television audiences ever saw them together on screen. The two first met at church while Clemens was still attending graduate school, and the connection between them formed almost immediately. Years later, Clemens would reflect on that first meeting with remarkable warmth, remembering how deeply genuine Fred Rogers seemed from the very beginning. He described Rogers as someone whose kindness could be felt almost instantly, even without words. But despite their close bond, the relationship eventually became far more complicated behind the scenes. For starters, Clemens already had mixed feelings about playing a police officer as a black man during a deeply tense period in American history. Race relations throughout the 1960s remained painfully strained, and law enforcement often represented fear and division within black communities rather than safety. At the same time, Clemens was also a gay man, living in an era when openly gay public figures faced enormous discrimination, especially in family entertainment. According to Clemens' memoir, Fred Rogers became deeply concerned about how public knowledge of Clemens' sexuality could affect the future of the show. Rogers reportedly feared that if Clemens came out publicly, the backlash could threaten everything they had spent years building. What followed would later become one of the most controversial aspects of Rogers' legacy. Clemens recalled that Rogers told him his sexuality did not personally change how he felt about him. However, Rogers also made it clear that he believed an openly gay cast member could jeopardize Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood at that point in history. According to Clemens, Rogers encouraged him to remain closeted while working on the program. The situation became even more painful when Rogers reportedly suggested that Clemens consider marrying a woman. Wanting to protect both the show and the career he cared about deeply, Clemens eventually followed that advice and married LaTanya Mae Sheridan. But the marriage ultimately did not last, ending in divorce in 1974. Even so, what makes the story especially remarkable is what happened afterward. Rather than carrying bitterness for the rest of his life, Clemens eventually chose forgiveness. Over time, he came to understand the enormous pressure Rogers had been under while trying to preserve the show and its mission during a far less accepting era in American culture. That understanding added a layer of humanity and complexity to both men's stories. And despite the painful parts of that chapter, Rogers and Clemens still managed to create something groundbreaking together. At a time when black representation on children's television remained extremely limited, Officer Clemens became one of the first recurring black characters on a major children's program in the United States. More importantly, he was portrayed with dignity, kindness, intelligence, and warmth. That alone carried enormous significance. But one particular scene would go on to become historic. In 1969, racial tensions surrounding public swimming pools were still incredibly intense across many parts of America. Segregation had officially been outlawed, but discrimination and hostility remained widespread. Even the simple act of black and white people sharing the same pool could trigger outrage in certain communities. Against that backdrop, Fred Rogers created one of the quietest yet most powerful moments in television history. During an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Rogers invited Officer Clemens to sit beside him and cool off by placing their feet in a small wading pool together. The two men shared the water peacefully side by side before Rogers later used the same towel to help dry Clemens' feet. There were no dramatic speeches, no angry debates, no grand announcement. Just a simple act of kindness and equality presented so naturally that children watching at home could immediately understand the message without needing it explained. That moment became a defining example of who Fred Rogers truly was. He rarely confronted social issues with loud political statements. Instead, he communicated through empathy, gentleness, and everyday human decency. Time and time again, he found ways to challenge prejudice by simply modeling compassion. And over the years, his role in American culture grew far beyond children's television. What began as one man trying to help kids understand their feelings slowly evolved into something much larger. For millions of people, Fred Rogers became a steady emotional anchor during some of the country's darkest and most uncertain moments. Even decades later, following tragedies like the September 11th attacks, many people found themselves returning to his words and teachings for comfort. That may be the most remarkable part of his legacy. Long after the sweaters, puppets, songs, and television sets faded into history, the feeling Fred Rogers gave people remained exactly the same. In moments of fear, grief, loneliness, or uncertainty, generations of viewers continued finding comfort in the calm voice of a man who spent his entire life reminding people that they mattered.